December 1944, the Ardennes forest. The trees, black and bare, stood like sentries in the icy fog. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and snow. Somewhere east of Bastogne, behind a low, snow-covered ridge, a Sherman tank lay in hiding, its steel armor coated with a layer of frost that merged with the pale morning light. Inside, 4 men kept their silent watch. Their breathing was short and labored, turning to vapor that settled on the cold metal. They had long since stopped feeling the difference between sweat and condensation, between fear and fatigue. The main gun had fired over 3 dozen shells that morning. The loader's arms burned with fire, and his back was numb from constant strain. The gunner's nerves were stretched to the limit, each shot echoing in them as a sharp, almost physical pain. But the real enemy wasn't the biting cold, nor the snow lashing against the vision slits, nor even the German tanks whose silhouettes occasionally appeared in the distance. The real enemy was the advancing silence, a silence that meant the end. The machine gun belts were running out. The turret-mounted Browning had fallen silent first, its receiver empty. The coaxial machine gun had only a few dozen rounds left, and those were in belts that had already jammed twice in the frost. The canvas swelled with moisture, the metal links became coated in ice, and the entire contraption became useless. No resupply, no communication, no hope for help. The tank commander, a lieutenant with a weathered face and cracked lips, never took his eyes off the ice-covered road where smoke still rose from the burnt-out skeletons of American trucks. He whispered something, the words lost to the howl of the wind, but everyone understood their meaning. This was the end. And then the loader, 22-year-old Calvin Briggs from a backwater county in Kentucky, reached under his seat for a worn burlap sack. He pulled out a bundle whose appearance caused bewilderment. It wasn't government issue. It looked homemade, even primitive. Strips of thick cotton cloth, sewn together by hand with uneven but sturdy stitches. Neat loops, evenly spaced along its entire length. In each loop, a .50 caliber cartridge packed as tightly as kernels on a corn cob at the height of harvest. The gunner threw him a brief, weary glance. His homemade contraption again. Calvin didn't say a word. He simply fed the belt into the gun's receiver. He had sewn it for weeks, during lulls between battles, by the light of a kerosene lamp, while the others slept or tried to forget. At first they had laughed at him. They called his invention Hillbilly Engineering. But now, in the very heart of a war that ground down men and machines with equal indifference, this was the last belt. And when he hit the trigger, the Sherman roared. Not for a few seconds, not for a few minutes. It roared for 4 hours straight. That roar became their anthem, their prayer, their only answer to the hell surrounding them. To understand Calvin Briggs, one had to go back, beyond the war, beyond the snow and the fear. One had to see him on the rolling pastures of Kentucky, where he was born and raised. His world before the war was one of mechanics and pragmatism. His family owned a small farm, and life there was hard, but honest. It taught him that every problem has a solution. You just had to find the right approach and apply your hands. Calvin's hands had been calloused since childhood, not from shell casings, but from the rusty bolts on his father's tractor and the old plow harnesses they couldn't afford to replace. He was one of those boys who could mend a fence with barbed wire and a belt buckle, gut a deer, grease a gearbox, and weld a broken axle before most of his peers had learned their multiplication tables. By 17, he had already built a working engine from junkyard parts, duct tape, and sheer stubbornness. But Calvin was more than just a handy farm boy. He possessed an insatiable drive to understand how things worked. He read mechanics magazines like others read sacred texts. He once walked several miles to a county fair just to see a new diesel generator in action. When war brewed in Europe, he followed the news with the grim interest of a man watching an approaching storm. Quiet, focused, always analyzing. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Calvin enlisted the next day. Not out of rage, nor out of the poster and parade patriotism. He went because he believed in doing things right. War, as he saw it, was the ultimate machine, terrifying, loud, merciless. And he figured that if someone like him, who understood how things worked, was there to keep the gears turning, maybe a few more boys would make it home. He was trained as a tank mechanic, but he didn't stay in the rear. He volunteered to serve as a loader in a combat unit, insisting that the best way to understand what broke was to be there when it broke. His superiors found him odd but reliable, quiet but not shy, and always tinkering. In North Africa, he fashioned a water boiler from old shell casings. In Italy, he repaired a broken track using wine barrel hoops. And during the long push through France, when supply lines were stretched to the limit and every nut and bolt mattered, legends began to circulate about Calvin Briggs. Not because he was a poster boy hero, but because he fixed what seemed hopeless. But his most important invention was born not under fire, but in silence, from boredom and observation. Late in the autumn of 1944, as winter began to grip the earth and the German counteroffensive was still just a grim rumor, Calvin noticed a dangerous pattern. The standard canvas belts for the Brownings on the Shermans kept jamming in the cold. The metal links warped, the fabric stiffened, absorbing moisture, and even the tiniest speck of ice could halt the lethal mechanism. And so he started sewing. At first it looked ridiculous. Strips of cotton from discarded uniforms, scraps of canvas from seat covers, even twine. He stitched the loops by hand, spacing them with the help of an empty cartridge case and a wooden ruler he had carved himself. He worked at night, hunched over a dim lamp, cursing when the needle pricked his finger. His comrades laughed, called it country handicraft. The gunner would ask sarcastically if he thought Hitler would surrender upon seeing this work of art. Calvin didn't argue. He never did. Instead, he kept refining his design, testing it. One day he loaded it into the backup gun during training exercises. The belt fed smoother than the standard issue. No jams, no snags, just clean, rhythmic fire. And yet no one took it seriously. The quartermaster refused to log it. The lieutenant just shook his head, said it wasn't regulation, and advised him to save it for the county fair back home. And so Calvin carefully rolled up his belt, placed it in the burlap sack, and stuffed it under his seat. Just in case. He couldn't imagine that this thing, mocked by everyone, would become the only thing standing between them and death. But war has a way of turning the absurd into the essential. And in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, that sack with its cloth belt was about to become the most important invention on the battlefield and a war machine. Starving for ammo, by December 1944, the Allied command was confident. The war in Europe was nearing its end. The June landings in Normandy, the liberation of Paris in August, the steady retreat of the Wehrmacht on all fronts, everything pointed to an imminent victory. Supply lines were indeed stretched thin, but morale remained high. Many soldiers sincerely believed they would spend Christmas at home, in warmth and safety, around the holiday table with their families. They were terribly mistaken. On the 16th of December, from the pre-dawn fog and cold of the Ardennes forest, Hitler launched his last, desperate blow. Operation Wacht am Rhein set in motion over 200,000 German soldiers, supported by 1,000 tanks and assault guns, with massive artillery support. This crushing fist fell upon the weakest point of the American defense, a seemingly quiet sector of the front, manned by inexperienced units and formations exhausted from previous battles. The strike was audacious, desperate, and caught the Allied command completely by surprise. The chaos that followed was absolute and all-consuming. The carefully built logistics collapsed overnight. Convoys carrying critically important winter gear, white camouflage suits, insulated boots, mittens, never reached the front lines. Fuel tankers were ambushed and destroyed on icy roads. Ammunition dumps, positioned too close to the front, vanished in the fire of German artillery barrages. Radio communication, the Army's nervous system, was disrupted by interference, sabotage, and the rapidly shifting front line. Tanks, deprived of fuel and shells, froze solid, becoming steel coffins embedded in snowdrifts. For the frontline crews like Calvin's, problems multiplied with every hour. In the inhuman cold, nothing worked as intended by engineers in warm offices. Engine oil thickened into a heavy sludge, forcing starters to strain, cranking the engines with a tortured whine. Batteries, showing a full charge just the evening before, were dead by morning, killed by the cold. Lubricant in the turret and gun mechanisms congealed, turning smooth movements into jerks and grinding. Even the simplest, most automated operation, feeding a belt of cartridges into the machine gun, became a complex logistical and physical challenge. The standard canvas belts with metal links, designed for 50 caliber rounds, were created for other theaters of war. In the scorching desert or dry autumn weather, they served reliably. But here, in the Ardennes, where the thermometer dropped far below zero and the air was saturated with icy moisture, as if filled with fine ice dust, the belts stiffened, losing flexibility. Moisture was absorbed into the dense fabric, froze within the fibers, expanded, and deformed the links. Soldiers tried to combat this with folk remedies. They warmed the belts against the tank's hot engine armor, rubbed them with lubricant from weapon oilers, wrapped them in woolen scarves and foot wraps. But as soon as intensive firing began, the friction, combined with the piercing cold and abrasive dirt, turned the belt into a useless, twisted, and jammed clump. A machine gun jam in tank warfare wasn't a mere nuisance. It was a death sentence for the entire crew. In the seconds the machine gun fell silent, enemy infantry could surround the immobilized vehicle, climb onto the armor, lower a Panzerfaust into an open hatch. If the loader failed to feed the gun, the main cannon would fall silent at the most critical moment of a duel with an enemy tank. This was exactly what was happening across the Ardennes salient. Entire armored units found themselves trapped, without supplies, without support, under the continuous pressure of experienced German divisions, who not only knew the terrain well, but were also equipped and trained for combat in harsh winter conditions. The American rear area communications were stretched to the limit, turning into a chaotic tangle of trucks stuck on icy back roads, where vehicles skidded, jackknifed, and burned. Fuel froze in tanks and pipelines. One tanker, who miraculously survived that hell, would later write in a letter home, "We weren't so much fighting the Germans as we were fighting the weather, the roads, and the fact that nothing we had, from a lighter to a tank, worked the way it was supposed to." It was under these conditions, at dawn on December 17th, that the crew of the Sherman with the call sign Lion Charlie 4 took up their position on a snow-covered hill. No resupply was expected for them. Their supply company had been decimated in a night battle. Rumors passed along the chain from the infantry suggested only 2 out of 8 trucks had survived. The rest were burning on the road near Malmedy, lighting the leaden sky with their fires. They had less than 200 rounds for their machine guns, meager scraps for the coming fight. Half of these were in belts that had already jammed during the previous day's skirmish. The rest lay loose at the bottom of a crate, useless as stones, without the links and metal fingers that could bind them into a lethal belt. And yet, they moved into position because they had to, because behind them were exhausted infantrymen, huddled in frozen trenches and a shattered road that someone had to cover, because there was no one else left to hold this sector. And as the sky darkened with snow clouds and the wind howled with renewed force through the cracks in the armor, Calvin Briggs felt it on an instinctual level, in the very core of his being. The war had been reduced to something simple, almost primitive, and therefore even more brutal. It was a battle of attrition. Who would last longer? Whose mechanism, whose will, whose stubbornness would not break would not fail first. And under his seat, in an old burlap sack reeking of gunpowder and sweat, lay that very thing, mocked by everyone that no one had paid any attention to. A homemade ammunition belt, sewn by the hands of a farm boy who had too much stubbornness and too little belief that something couldn't be made better if one tried hard enough and understood the core of the problem: mockery and isolation. It's not regulation, kid. In the world of war, fine-tuned to mechanical precision, there was no room for the non-standard. The uniform was not just clothing. It was a symbol of uniformity, a guarantee that every cog in the giant war machine knew its place. Regulations were not a set of guidelines, but holy scripture, and any deviation from the canon, no matter how well-intentioned, was met with a wall of misunderstanding and outright scorn. Calvin Briggs learned this lesson early, facing the deafening wall of army bureaucracy and soldierly skepticism. He showed his prototype belt to the crew during one of the rare lulls, while they were parked in an abandoned apple orchard right on the border with Germany. It was a soggy, damp autumn. The sky hung low and grey. The soldiers warmed their freezing hands on metal cups of coffee, bitter as quinine. Calvin, usually silent and reserved, demonstrated his work with uncharacteristic timidity and a vague sense of pride. The belt was unimpressive to look at, worn, in places greasy fabric, rough but sturdy stitches, cartridges sitting in handmade loops. It was a product of necessity and patience, not aesthetics. The first reaction was bewildered laughter. The driver, a guy from Brooklyn, snorted and asked if it was a scarf for bullets. The gunner, Staff Sergeant Lewis Hall, a man with a sharp tongue and a cynical outlook on life, skeptically turned the belt over in his hands and asked if Calvin was planning to sew for the Red Cross now. Even Lieutenant Jarvis, usually stingy with emotions, couldn't suppress a skeptical smirk. He was a man of rules, drilled by the West Point system, and anything outside regulations triggered an instinctive rejection. His verdict was brief and final. "It's not Army issue, soldier, and there are reasons for that." Calvin tried to explain. He spoke calmly and methodically, like a mechanic explaining how an engine works. He talked about the jams, how the fabric absorbed moisture and stiffened in the frost, how the metal links warped from temperature changes. He described the long hours spent on painstaking work, measuring the distances between loops, testing each batch of fabric for strength and flexibility. His logic was ironclad, his arguments irrefutable from a practical standpoint. But he was met with a wall of weary cynicism. After months of heavy fighting, losses, and deprivation, most soldiers clung to the familiar, the tested, even if that tested thing stopped working. Innovation required mental energy, which no one had left. The Army supplied them with certain equipment, so that's how it must be. Thinking differently was not only useless, but dangerous. That night, while others drank captured schnapps or played poker, Calvin sat alone by the side of the tank. He carefully wiped his belt with a rag soaked in gun oil, and tenderly, almost affectionately, rolled it up and put it back in the burlap sack. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince anyone anymore, but he didn't stop either. It wasn't stubbornness, but rather a quiet, unshakable confidence in his own rightness. While others rested, he experimented with different types of fabric, from thick canvas to cotton from old T-shirts. He mixed various impregnation compounds based on wax, grease, and oils, searching for the perfect formula that would protect from moisture, but not make the fabric brittle. He practiced different types of stitches to find the strongest and most wear-resistant one. He gradually became a quiet curiosity in the company, a subject of constant, though not malicious, jokes. "The textile specialist," they teased him. If someone's machine gun jammed in a tank, someone would inevitably yell, "Hey, Briggs, give us one of your blankets." If a standard belt froze solid, remarks were heard. "Maybe it's time to give the guy his sewing machine back?" And yet, curiously, despite all the mockery, no one threw his invention away. It wasn't used, but it wasn't destroyed either. The belt just lay there in its sack under the seat, like a talisman, like a ghost of an alternative. Deep down, in the subconscious of even the most hardened skeptics, a faint spark of hope smoldered that this strange, quiet guy from Kentucky might actually know something. The system gave its official response. The quartermaster, a tired captain burdened with paperwork, refused to log the belts. "The United States Army is not a haberdashery workshop, soldier," he snapped, without even looking at the sample. "Take what's on the table of organization or take nothing." One of the old-timer sergeants passing by sarcastically tossed out that if Calvin kept this up, he'd soon be put to sewing uniforms for the Krauts. The message was clear and unambiguous. Any initiative not sanctioned from above was equated with insubordination or even direct disobedience. Innovation required permission, and the army gave no permission to think differently. But Calvin never sought permission. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone or challenge the system. His motivation was simpler and deeper. He just wanted his machine gun to fire when it was needed. He had seen what happened to tanks whose weapons jammed at a critical moment. He remembered with too vivid, painful clarity the burnt-out hulls of Shermans and Stuarts littering the roads of Normandy, the torn-open turrets from which he and others had to pull out the charred, lifeless bodies of comrades. He had heard the last, desperate screams over the radio, drowned out by explosions. And so, while others laughed, he kept sewing. Something, deeply hidden in his bones, told him the worst was yet to come. That a storm was brewing, compared to which all previous battles would seem like a light warm-up. And when that storm hit, he would not be the one standing there with a jammed machine gun, helplessly tugging at the bolt and cursing the supply officers who would never come. He would be ready, even if the whole world, in the form of his crew and the entire army apparatus, did not believe in him. His faith was not in recognition, but in the rightness of what he had done. And that faith proved to be enough. The battle begins. The frozen hell of the Ardennes. Dawn on December 17th never truly arrived in the conventional sense. Light did not break through the clouds. It merely dispersed the darkness slowly and reluctantly, turning it into a grey, damp murk. A leaden sky, heavy and low, hung over the forest like the lid of a giant coffin. Snow fell in a thick, blinding sheet, covering the earth's wounds, but powerless to hide the ugly scars of war. Craters, burnt-out vehicle husks, the black skeletons of trees. The trees, blackened by soot and frost, stood as mute, mournful sentinels of this new kind of hell, frozen in silent horror at what men were doing. The Sherman with the call sign Lion Charlie 4 was one of 6 such machines that had taken up position on a snow-covered, sloping ridge. They weren't lined up. They didn't form a classic battle formation. There was neither time nor space for that. They had simply dug into the frozen ground where they could, creating an improvised strongpoint meant to cover the only semi-passable road, a former logging trail now turned into a vital yet deadly supply artery. Or more accurately, it had been such until German artillery turned it into a lunar landscape, pockmarked with craters and debris. Inside the tank, a peculiar atmosphere reigned, a cocktail of contradictions. The piercing cold emanating from the steel walls combined with the sticky, sharp fear hanging in the air. The air was thick with smells, exhaust fumes, gunpowder, machine oil, sweat, and something else, metallic and sweetish, the smell of fear. Calvin Briggs sat in his loader's seat, his body, encased in coveralls, automatically performing habitual movements, checking the breech, a quick glance at the shell racks. His fingers, despite gloves, were numb with cold, but they didn't tremble. There was only focused readiness. The radio, their link to the outside world, had been silent for hours, emitting only the hiss of static. Their last order, received deep in the night, was concise and terrifying. Hold the crossroads at all costs. The first shell came without any warning. There was no familiar whine of an approaching round, just a sudden, deafening roar, and a fountain of snow, frozen earth, and splinters from shattered trees erupted skyward 20 meters to their right. The blast was physical. It struck the armor, resonating in the bones of the men inside. The voice of Lieutenant Jarvis, usually even and authoritative, now sounded over the intercom with a new, harsh edge. Contact front. Gunner, eyes on. Loader, stand ready. Calvin lunged for the shell rack, his body, despite fatigue and cold, working on autopilot, movements perfected to a science. The 76mm shell, weighing 48 pounds, was on his lap. Through the vision slit, he saw flickering shadows in the forest, grey-green patches of camouflage, cautious movement behind tree trunks. German infantry chains, supported by something heavier, hinted at by the dull clank of tracks. What followed were minutes stretched into eternity, filled with hellish tension. The gunner's commands shouted through clenched teeth, the sharp, deafening report of the main gun making ears pop and shaking the entire hull. Recoil, the clang of an empty casing falling to the floor. And again, a new shell into the breach. Up, Calvin reported, his voice the only thing that remained level in this chaos. They fired high explosive at the infantry, armor-piercing at the emerging silhouettes of enemy armor in the distance. The Sherman shuddered and roared, spewing death. Then came the moment everyone had subconsciously feared, the moment that turned the steel giant into a helpless target. The machine gun, their primary weapon against infantry, choked and fell silent. A sharp, abrupt command from the gunner. Calvin pulled on the belt. It wouldn't budge. Frozen, swollen with moisture, it was jammed solid in the receiver. He tried to pull it out, but the canvas was like brittle ice, ready to snap in his hands. The coaxial machine gun by the main cannon still had rounds, but only a few dozen, and the grey-green figures in the forest were getting closer, clearer. Too close. No more than 100 meters away. Briggs, come on, move it! Gunner Hall's voice rose to a shout, in which one could hear not anger anymore, but panic. Calvin flipped open the ammunition bin lid. His eyes scanned the contents. Nothing. Nothing but a scattering of loose rounds and 2 spare standard-issue belts they had already tried during training and rejected for constant jamming. They lay there, stiff and lifeless, their metal links slightly deformed, rendering them useless. And then his gaze fell downward. The old worn burlap sack was still in its place, under the seat, still tightly packed. Calvin looked at it, then at Hall, who was beginning to lose his composure, his eyes hollow with anger and fear. "We're going to lose the gun! Come on, damn it!" Calvin didn't explain, didn't ask for permission. There was no time for that. He simply acted. With a sharp movement, he untied the sack, pulled out his hand-stitched belt, and fed it into the machine gun's receiver. His movements were precise, calm, almost mechanical. The gunner's eyes widened in astonishment. "You serious? With that thing?" But Calvin didn't utter a word. His hands seemed to live a life of their own, a life subservient to a single goal, survival. The belt, impregnated with wax and grease, slid into the receiver smoothly, without a single hitch. There was no familiar resistance, no grinding. The treated fabric remained flexible even in this icy hell, the cartridges sitting squarely and securely in their handmade loops, lined up like soldiers on parade. The gunner, not taking his astonished eyes off Calvin, squeezed the trigger, and the Sherman shuddered with a new, unfamiliar roar. This time, the machine gun didn't cough a short burst and choke. It stuttered. A long, continuous, furious burst that didn't stop for a second. Tra-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. The sound was even, rhythmic. almost musical after the chaotic firing of the previous minutes. The Germans, rising for the decisive push, hit the dirt and then began to scramble back haphazardly, seeking cover behind trees. For the first time all morning, since the battle began, a silence fell inside the tank, if it could be called silence, broken only by the steady, relentless roar of the machine gun that did not jam. It worked. Minutes stretched into hours. The belt fed smoothly and unfailingly, loop after loop, cartridge after cartridge. The mocked invention, the hillbilly engineering, the country handicraft. It proved more reliable than anything else they had. More reliable than the standard, government-issue, commission-approved equipment. And this was a bitter, surreal paradox that no one cared about right now. It worked. The 4-hour miracle. The fire doesn't stop by the 3rd hour of continuous fighting. Lion Charlie 4 remained the only operational tank on its section of the ridge. 2 other Shermans burned as sinister torches, casting flickering reflections on the churned-up snow. A third, having taken a direct hit to its tracks, sat helplessly immobilized, turned into a stationary firing position, but soon its gun too fell silent. Now only their tank, a lone steel fortress, continued to hold the position. Thick black smoke poured from the engine's ventilation grills, mixing with steam coming from the superheated metal. The barrel of the main gun glowed with a dull red heat, waves of warmth radiating from it, perceptible even through the armor. The floor of the fighting compartment was carpeted with brass shell casings that rattled and jumped with every turn of the turret, creating a mad cacophony of a victory march. Outside, a scene of apocalypse unfolded. The snow was no longer white. It had turned into a gray-brown, ugly slush, churned up by explosions, saturated with diesel fuel, blood, and ash. But the machine gun kept firing. The Browning M1919 coaxial machine gun, now fed exclusively by the 3 homemade belts Calvin had made, had fired nearly 500 rounds. Each of these belts had been produced in the silence of weeks past, in the shadow of the tank, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, by hands more accustomed to holding a wrench than a needle. Every loop had been measured by hand using a homemade wooden ruler, every thread stitched with double strength, every strip of fabric impregnated with a specially formulated mix of wax and animal fat for flexibility in the cold. And now, in this hell, that patient, solitary craftsmanship was paying off 100-fold. Round after round, without a single stoppage, without the slightest jam, the belt fed like clockwork. The steady, cyclical thump, thump, thump became the soundtrack of their survival. Tra-ta-ta. Tra-ta-ta. It was the sound of the impossible made real. The Germans, stunned and furious, did not cease their attempts. Twice they tried to flank the position, using the folds in the terrain and the dense undergrowth. Both times the machine gun met them with a hail of lead, raking through the woodland, forcing the enemy soldiers to press themselves into the ground, leaving dark, motionless stains on the snow. One group, emboldened by a temporary lull, attempted a bayonet charge with grenades. They didn't manage 10 steps. A long burst cut them down like a scythe through grass before they could cross the line of old, half-filled trenches. In the heat of the battle, through the smoke and chaos, a German armored vehicle crawled from the west, something between a half-track and a reconnaissance vehicle. Its commander, confident, stood in the open hatch, giving orders. Hall, without flinching, traversed the turret. The coaxial machine gun followed the movement. Calvin, never looking up, fed the belt, his movements practiced to automatism. 20 rounds, another 10. The windshield of the armored vehicle shattered into 1,000 pieces. The commander's figure disappeared inside. The vehicle jerked sharply to the side, traveled a few meters, and, hitting a stump, exploded, scattering burning debris across the clearing. From the nearest American positions, from the trenches where infantrymen clung to life, came a faint but fierce cry of approval. Inside the tank, a stupor prevailed, broken only by the monotonous drone of the machine gun and terse commands. Calvin didn't smile. There wasn't a trace of triumph on his face. There was only absolute, almost trance-like concentration. He was already loading the last of his 3 belts, carefully threading its start into the receiver. The last 6 feet of hand-stitched hope. Lieutenant Jarvis, his face black with soot and sweat, leaned down, wiping his fogged goggles. His voice, usually sharp, now sounded muffled, and with a hint of what might have been astonishment. "You sure that thing isn't witchcraft?" Calvin, without taking his eyes off his work, shook his head. "No, sir. Just stitched right." Jarvis gave a short, hoarse chuckle. "Remind me to put that in the after-action report." But it was no longer just their miracle. Other crews, desperate, exhausted, seeing that Lion Charlie 4 continued to lay down murderous fire while their own machine guns remained silent, began to improvise. By the 4th hour of battle, 2 men from a neighboring disabled Sherman, risking their lives, sent their loader across open, fire-swept ground to reach their tank and ask for anything that could help. One of them took Calvin's 2nd spare belt with him. Another crew, seeing the effectiveness of the design, tried to copy it on the spot, cutting their own woolen shirts and uniforms into strips, using needles from medic kits and thread pulled from sleeping bags. Suddenly, the Army's problem wasn't a lack of courage, but a lack of simple cloth. And Calvin Briggs, just yesterday a laughingstock, a quiet mechanic with a farmer's hobby, became the unspoken, yet only, key to holding the entire defensive line. And then the German artillery suddenly ceased fire. The roar that had hung over the forest for hours was replaced by a ringing, deafening silence. German attacks became less furious, shorter, less coordinated. Smoke drifted slowly and lazily between the black tree trunks in long, ghostly ribbons. Bodies in field-grey uniforms littered the slopes, darkening against the white snow. The fierce attack that had begun in the morning had run into an unexpected, unbreachable wall, and that wall was built of steel, human sweat, and a single, hand-stitched belt into which the last hope had been woven. The silence. After the storm, when the firing finally stopped, the silence that fell over the Ardennes was deafening. It was a physical presence, thick and heavy, pressing in on the eardrums after hours of relentless noise. The forest, minutes before a cacophony of explosions, machine gun fire, and screams, now lay under a bruised twilight sky. Smoke twisted in lazy, ghostly ribbons through the shattered treetops. Ancient oaks and pines stood split down the middle, their splintered trunks pointing skyward like accusing fingers. Craters steamed in the frozen earth, and the snow, where it wasn't churned into muddy slush, was stained a dark, ugly red that was already beginning to blacken in the cold. Inside Lion Charlie 4, the crew sat in a stunned, deafened vacuum. The sudden absence of sound was more disorienting than the battle itself. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite, hot metal, sweat, and something else, the sharp, coppery tang of blood. No one moved, no one spoke. They were simply alive, and the sheer, improbable fact of it was too immense to process immediately. The coaxial machine gun's barrel was a blackened, smoking stub, almost too hot to touch. But the feed tray, where Calvin's belt had spent the last 4 hours, was clean, functional, a testament to the miracle that had just unfolded. Lieutenant Jarvis was the first to break the spell. He moved slowly, as if his limbs were made of lead, and pushed himself halfway out of the commander's hatch. The cold air that rushed in was a shocking, clean contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. He scanned the ridge, his eyes taking in the smouldering wrecks of their sister tanks, the scattered German dead, the scarred landscape. He dropped back down into the turret, his face a mask of grime and exhaustion. He turned to Calvin, who was still seated, staring at his raw, blistered hands. "What was that thing made of again?" Jarvis's voice was a dry rasp, barely audible. Calvin cleared his own throat, which felt like sandpaper. "Cotton strips, sir. Wax. Some stitching from a seat harness." Jarvis blinked slowly, the information processing behind his weary eyes. "And it never jammed? Not once?" "No, sir," Calvin said simply. "Not once." The lieutenant gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then he reached for his notebook, the pages smudged with dirt and oil. He flipped to a blank page, not in the back for unofficial notes, but right in the middle of the log. He began to write. It wasn't a reprimand, it wasn't a casual note, it was a record. An entry for something that had, against all odds and regulations, worked. 2 hours later, as the wounded were being stabilized and a precarious calm settled over the sector, a group of officers picked their way through the debris towards Lion Charlie 4. Among them were hard-faced logistics sergeants, 2 lieutenants from other mauled platoons, and a captain from battalion headquarters, his uniform strikingly clean amidst the universal filth. They had all come to see the belt. The very same belt that had been a source of mockery was now laid out carefully on the rear engine deck of the Sherman, stretched out like some sacred relic unearthed from a battlefield. It was darkened with powder residue, stiff in sections from the intense heat of sustained fire, but every single hand-stitched loop had held its shape. The wax coating had melted and reset, sealing the fabric against the moisture it was designed to defeat. The captain, a man with a hawk-like nose and a scrutinizing gaze, examined it for a full, silent minute, his hands clasped behind his back. He finally looked up, his eyes finding Calvin, who stood a few feet away, looking more like a grimy mechanic than a savior. "Where did you learn to do this, son?" The captain asked, his tone neutral, devoid of the mockery Calvin had grown accustomed to. Calvin looked down at his grease-stained gloves, then back at the officer. "My dad, sir. Farm stuff. Fixing gear. Sewing up feed sacks when they tore." The captain nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. This wasn't West Point theory. This was Kentucky pragmatism. "Think you could make a few more?" he asked, the question hanging in the frozen air. Calvin met his gaze. "I can try, sir. Try fast," the captain said, and with that the conversation was over. The order had been given. By the next morning, Calvin Briggs had been temporarily pulled from frontline duty. The order came straight from battalion command. His new assignment was a leaky supply tent less than a mile from the ridge, now hastily converted into an improvisational workshop. They gave him bolts of heavy cotton canvas, rolls of thick thread, awls, and needles. They even assigned him 2 other soldiers who claimed to have some skill with a needle. One had been a tailor's apprentice in Chicago, the other had helped his mother with quilting back in Iowa. They worked hunched over crates under a flapping canvas tarp, their hands shaking from the cold and the lingering adrenaline, cutting and stitching while the distant thump of artillery served as a constant reminder that the war was far from over. It was a surreal sight. 3 soldiers in a Belgian forest sewing like their lives depended on it, because they now understood that it did. By the end of that first day, they had produced 9 new belts. By the end of the week, the count was 34. Word spread through the battered units like wildfire. Crews from across the sector, their own machine guns silenced by the cold, began requesting Briggs belts, as they were now unofficially christened. Some copied the design outright. Others experimented with variations, adding extra rows of stitching, trying different loop sizes, testing oil-based sealants against Calvin's wax formula. None were quite as reliable as the originals stitched by Calvin's own hand, but they worked. They fed. They didn't jam. More importantly, they gave the crews something that had been in short supply: confidence. In the brutal calculus of tank warfare, nothing was more dangerous than hesitation. and nothing caused hesitation faster than the fear that your weapon would fail you the moment you needed it most. Thanks to a 22-year-old farm kid from Kentucky who refused to accept that good enough was good enough, there was now one less thing to worry about inside a Sherman. The quiet echo. The war in Europe ended 5 months later. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Victory in Europe Day. The news ignited a firestorm of celebration across the Allied world. In London and New York, streets overflowed with jubilant crowds, strangers embraced, bottles of champagne were uncorked in a shower of foam and triumph. But in a quiet field hospital near Liège, Belgium, Calvin Briggs did not celebrate. He slept. For the first time in what felt like years, he slept a deep, dreamless sleep. The kind of sleep that comes only when the constant, grinding fear has finally, unbelievably, lifted. He had been working around the clock even after the bulge was officially contained, his hands moving almost independently, producing belt after belt in that dim supply tent. The Briggs belts, as they were now universally known, had spread like a quiet rumor of hope. They traveled in the pockets of loaders, in the ammo crates of resupply trucks, passed from one desperate crew to another. By March, they had made their way across 3 different divisions. They were never formally adopted into the official army supply chains. No quartermaster ever stamped them with a stock number, no factory ever tooled up for their mass production. They remained a grassroots innovation, a piece of battlefield folklore, praised in hushed, grateful tones by the men whose lives they had literally saved. Calvin was offered a recommendation for a Bronze Star. A captain sat with him, filling out the paperwork, speaking of valor and initiative under fire. Calvin listened quietly, then declined. He said the real heroes were the men who never made it home, the ones whose names were now etched on white crosses that stretched in endless, sobering rows across Europe. The medal felt like it would belong to someone else, to a story that was grander and simpler than his own. His story was one of thread and cloth, of a simple, stubborn refusal to let a machine fail. When he returned to Kentucky later that year, the farm was still standing, but barely. The war had taken its toll here, too. His father had passed during the long months of his absence, and his younger brother, too young to enlist, had done his best to keep the place running against a tide of debt and decay. Calvin picked up where he had left off, the weight of a tank shell replaced by the heft of a wrench. He fixed tractors that had sat idle for years. He welded gates and mended fences. He married a kind-eyed schoolteacher named June, built a life, raised 2 children. He never bragged, never hung medals on the wall. Most of his neighbors never knew he had served at all, let alone that he had quietly helped bend the course of one of the war's most ferocious battles with nothing but cloth, grease, and an unshakable faith in doing things right. But the war, in its own way, remembered him. A few letters trickled in over the years, finding their way to the rural route address in Lyon County. One from a former tank commander in the 99th Infantry Division, who wrote simply, "Your quilt held when everything else fell apart." Another from a supply officer in Bastogne, a man who had once scoffed at the idea, now expressing a belated, profound gratitude. One from a crewman Calvin had never met, who wrote, "You don't know me, but your belt worked. And because of that, I got to see my daughter turn 1. Calvin never replied to most of them. He didn't need to. He hadn't made the belt for recognition. He had made it because something was broken, and he possessed the unique, quiet conviction that he could fix it. Decades passed. He built a small garage on the edge of town, a place filled with the smell of oil and metal. He taught his son how to change brake pads and his daughter how to solder wires, passing on not just knowledge, but a philosophy. That understanding how things work is the first step to making them work better. He stayed quiet during parades, waved politely at Veterans Day gatherings, always listening more than he talked. a man comfortable in the silence he had earned. But once a year, on a cold, clear morning in December, he would walk out to the old barn, its timbers sagging with age. He'd pull down a dusty cardboard box from a high rafter and carefully unwrap the oilcloth inside. There, faded and frayed at the edges, was one of the original belts, a strip of cotton cloth, darkened with age, the stitching still visible, each loop a testament to a night spent by a flickering lantern. He would run his thumb over the fabric, his old calloused fingers tracing the path they had made decades ago. It wasn't a memory of violence or glory he sought. It was a memory of efficacy, of a problem solved. His son, now a man, found him there one year and asked, "Dad, did you really shoot the Germans with that?" Calvin smiled, a small, quiet thing. "No," he said, his voice soft but clear in the still barn air. "But I helped someone who did. That was enough." He died in his sleep in 1989, just a few days after he had finally, to his own satisfaction, repaired the same old tractor he and his father had worked on together before the war ever cast its shadow. No grand monument bears his name. No textbook tells his story in its pages. But if you were to ask any man who served in that frozen hell of the Ardennes that winter, the one they called the Battle of the Bulge, some of them might just remember. They might remember a lone Sherman holding a ridge against impossible odds. They might remember the strange, unwavering rhythm of a machine gun that refused to fall silent. And they might remember, or have heard the story, of the quiet man, the loader, the farm boy from Kentucky who stitched life into a belt when the world was falling apart around him. War is so often remembered in the stark, impersonal language of numbers. 16 million Americans served. Over 400,000 never returned. Tens of thousands of tanks rolled across Europe. Millions of rounds fired. Billions of dollars spent. But behind every statistic, there is a face, a name, a story, a single, small moment where everything could have gone one way, but went another because of a simple, human action. Calvin Briggs didn't win the war. He didn't lead a charge or capture an enemy general. His name never made the front page of a newspaper. But for 4 hours in the heart of a frozen forest, when the complex, industrialized machinery of modern warfare broke down, when the manuals failed and the official gear proved inadequate, his invention worked. It worked because it was made not in a factory, but by hands that understood machines intimately. It worked because it was born not from a top-down order, but from patient observation, from learning from failure, and from a quiet, unyielding determination. It worked because he cared enough not to wait for someone else to solve the problem. There is a profound lesson in that. In a world that often encourages passivity, that teaches us to wait for instructions, to follow the manual, Calvin Briggs stitched a different answer. Not for fame, not for glory, but because he refused to accept that good enough was acceptable when lives hung in the balance. In the grand, chaotic theater of war, we are taught to look for heroism in the dramatic gesture, the loud explosion, the bold charge. But sometimes the most profound heroism looks like a young man, hunched over a solitary lamp, his fingers raw and numb, patiently measuring thread against spent cartridge casings, sewing in silence while the rest of the world sleeps or laughs or despairs. And when the smoke finally clears and the long silence returns, it is often those small, seemingly insignificant acts, the ones nobody noticed at the time, the ones born of pure, unadulterated competence, that end up making all the difference in the world. That is the enduring paradox of World War II, the greatest industrial conflict in history. It was won not only by the grand strategies of generals and the immense output of factories, but also by the countless, quiet individuals who saw something broken in their immediate world and dared to fix it. Even if the tools were as simple as cloth and thread and a pair of hands that, though they might shake from the cold, never shook in their purpose. We don't remember Calvin Briggs because he demanded to be remembered. We remember him because in a moment of absolute crisis, when the machine gun wouldn't fire and the cold rendered steel useless and death waited patiently in the snowy trees, he gave the Sherman its voice back. And for 4 relentless, impossible hours, that voice roared through the forest, a voice of defiance, of ingenuity, of pure, unbroken human will.